Louise Thrushwood was a modest, motherly mouse that lived within the walls of a quiet 2-story home. If anything could be considered loud in her home, it would be the bellies of her grandchildren, and as the family's food provider, it was her duty to keep them quiet. Each morning, before the sunrise, she would make her way to the house's kitchen to gather crumbs, drippings, and other scraps that had been carelessly left behind by the house's larger residents. This was the Thrushwood way, to take only what was left behind while no one was around to care. The most reward with the smallest risk. It allowed her and her family to live in the house without its residents being any the wiser, and she wouldn't hear any talk of her family being a bunch of thieves. As her father always used to tell her, it's not stealing if nobody wants it. Louise had never encountered any of the house's giants, but she knew that they were fond of midnight snacking and less fond of cleaning up after themselves. As a result, most of what Louise scavenged consisted of various cheeses, crackers, and cookies, which made up the majority of her family's diet. She would have liked if the housemasters snacked on some more fruits and veggies now and again, but scavengers couldn't be choosers. Wielding her father's sword, which had grown far too dull for combat, she would poke each crumb, inspect it, and place it in her basket if it passed her inspection. That morning, she happened upon something truly special in the midst of rounding up a scattering of cookie crumbs. One of the crumbs in question happened to contain a fully intact chocolate chip, the food of the gods. After sniffing it to confirm it wasn't just a raisin, she held it up to gaze at its shine in the sunlight. She so badly wanted to taste it. It had been months since anyone in her family had even smelled chocolate. But she had to restrain herself. Her father had always warned her about snacking while scavenging. One thoughtless bite could quickly lead to an empty basket, and Louise couldn't bear the thought of her family going hungry because of her. After depositing the final crumb into her basket, Louise sheathed her sword and immediately headed for home. She didn't want to risk sticking around once the housemasters woke up. The less time she spent outside her mouse hole, the better. The Thrushwood home was already full of life by the time Louise returned. The triplets were playing around on the couch. Sophia was hard at work putting her ribbons on everything, and Elizabeth was skulking in the corner practicing her evil stare. Louise's grandkids all threw out a warm welcome upon their grandmother's arrival, though Louise's own kids were a little preoccupied. Adam and Abigail were still sleeping like a rock and a log, respectively, acting as additional props for Sophia's decorations. Meanwhile, Morgan was already doing the prep work for breakfast. She was never one to take it easy. Louise wanted to keep the little surprise that she had found that morning a secret, especially from Morgan. It was difficult enough to convince her to feed her kids the cookie crumbs she scavenged, but Louise understood. It was Morgan's job as the mother to be a stick in the mud. But at the same time, Louise felt it was her duty as the grandmother to spoil her grandkids rotten. As long as she was the scavenger in the house, she'd make sure they got a little sugar in their diet. Louise did wonder how much longer that would be, though. More and more, Morgan had been hinting that Louise consider retiring her role as the family scavenger. Louise was already in her mid-50s, and her vision wasn't exactly as sharp as it used to be. Louise could see her point, but every time she thought about hanging up her cape, she'd remember the smiling faces of her little ones every morning she brought in a basket of goodies. It made her feel like she was doing her part, like she was a precious member of the family that couldn't be forgotten like her father was. She had a role to play, and she was the best to play it. Morgan, Adam, and Abigail had only scavenged a handful of times, and they still had a long way to go. Morgan was too cautious, and she couldn't find enough crumbs to fill her basket. Adam had a tendency to snack on the job, and Abby was too easily distracted by the wonders of the larger house. Louise wanted to see them improve, but she wasn't ready to let go of her title just yet. She knew that she had many more adventures left in her. As lively as the Thrushwood household could become, nothing turned it on quite like mealtime. No Thrushwood nose could resist the siren song of the dinner table, especially during breakfast when the crumbs were at their freshest. Even the most tasteless of saltines burst with flavour when placed on a plate with a sprinkle of grandmotherly love. unlike the patrons of the larger house, they would not leave one crumb behind. Dropped food would be eaten off the floor without hesitation. To do otherwise would be hypocritical. Louise had melted down the chocolate chip to use as a topping to the cheese, cracker and cookie crumbs she'd scavenged that morning. She'd played the role of the chocolate fairy, sprinkling a little touch of heaven into each of their plates. When it came to Morgan's kids, however, it didn't take much in the tank to get their engines running. Davy grabbed his ball from the living room to toss around. Sophia started biting her food face first like a wild animal, and Abigail suddenly found it difficult to resist teasing her twin brother. They were almost as energetic after eating it as they were just to see it. Even picky little Elizabeth had a chance of joining the clean plate club with chocolate on the table. Louise couldn't begin to measure her joy at seeing the table so alive. Morgan, on the other hand, was on full damage control, striving to quell the storm that was brewing as a result of combining her kids and sugar. She'd never understand why her mother enjoyed causing such chaos. As she attempted to wipe the chocolate off a jittering Sophia's face, Davy threw his ball a little too hard, knocking off Douglas's glasses and flying back into the living room. Dirk was naturally upset with this maneuver, as it was actually his ball, and he didn't like the looks of where it was flying. Morgan chastised Davy for playing around at the dinner table, failing to notice just where that ball was heading. The ball had rolled all the way from the dining room table, across the living room, and out toward the front door. Were the door shut, it would have harmlessly bounced off it. However, in the excitement of preparing her chocolate topping, Louise had forgotten to close the door behind her. Thus, there was nothing to stop the ball from rolling through the open door and into the untamed wilderness of the larger house. If there was one rule in the Thrushwood house, it was to never leave the safety of the mouse hole after sunrise for any reason. Under Morgan's rules, even looking outside of the mouse hole was grounds for a spanking. It was a rule for the adults as well as the children, though for the adults it was more of a strong suggestion. There was no telling what awaited them out there once the rest of the house was awake, and none of them were too keen on finding out. Even so, Dirk and Davy only had the one ball, and it wasn't as though there was a store around for them to buy another. If the larger residents found the ball and took it away, it would be gone forever. Louise volunteered to retrieve it, insisting there was no cause for concern. Their mouse hole had intentionally been dug out far away from any of the large furniture that could conceal predators, and the ball hadn't rolled too far out anyway. Louise was experienced enough to know what she could and couldn't get away with. She hung up her apron and strolled out to retrieve it with a casual, "Be right back," not even bothering to grab her sword or cape. Morgan was less optimistic about the idea. She wanted to tell her mother to stop, but Sophia, still high on her sugar rush, cut her off with the unrelenting demand to be read The Legend of Ice Cream again. In truth, Morgan didn't want her boys to lose their favourite toy either. She was just very partial to her grandfather's mantra of no unnecessary risks. At the very least, she wished her mother would put her cape on if she was going outside. She'd die of embarrassment if another mouse family saw her mother like that. Louise's plan of attack was simple. Walk outside, pick up the ball, run back inside. As long as nothing jumped out at her and pinned her to the wall, she was sure that there would be no issues. But there was something else. Something far more dangerous lurking in the outside world to prey on her. Not a predator, not a monster, but a smell. A smell that surpassed any she had ever experienced. The many years of scavenging had strengthened Louise with a fair amount of willpower. When out on the prowl for crumbs or serving her kids at the dinner table, she was pretty good at keeping her tongue in her mouth. But when it came to real food, the sort that was actually made to be eaten by someone, she was exposed for the glutton she truly was. Her nose had a mind of its own. At that moment, finding the source of the smell was all that mattered. All other thoughts were purged from her mind. She couldn't be shocked out of her mental state if her tail was shoved directly into an electrical socket. She had to know what it was. Following the smell with pinpoint accuracy, she made her way across the living room to the nearby door. The scent was coming straight through the vent that passed right across into the opposite room. In other words, It was coming from the kitchen. She couldn't map the scent to any food item she could name. Was it sour or sweet? Salty or spicy? She didn't know. But she had to know. The smell was too good to be true. She pushed her head through the large flap at the base of the door to see what mysteries awaited her. Louise was no stranger when it came to cats. She had seen lazy cats, mean cats, dumb cats, snooky cats, and even dog-like cats. Her strongest memory was at the old barn where she and her father once lived. There was one scrawny orange barn cat tasked to protect the silo from vermin. He was a pitiful creature, really, frightened off by a simple poke to the hindquarters with her father's sword. Over time, Louise's father managed to train him to fetch the leftovers from the farmer's table and save him the trouble of scavenging. Over time, Louise saw the cat as a friendly companion, like a big teddy bear that brought her food. The creature on the other side of that door flap, though, was no teddy bear. Its appearance was so striking that it knocked Louise out of her trance. The beast was covered from head to tail in a forest of thick fur. Much of the forest was coated in a bright brown, with white markings lighting up its cheeks, feet, belly, and tail tip. The white markings on its feet and tail were preceded by heavy patches of dark brown, resembling the broken shackles of an escaped prison convict. That same dark shade of brown formed long, jagged stripes that descended down her back and forehead, like scars obtained in the process of escaping said prison. Most intimidating of all, her side boasted a unique and unusual marking of the same dark colour in the shape of a foreboding skull. As the cat turned around, Louise could see the same marking miraculously adorn both sides, making the creature equally intimidating no matter which way it was facing. The cat's fur was certainly off-putting, but what really struck Louise was how massive the beast was in size. While the vast amount of fluff obscured the creature's true size, this was definitely one fat cat. It made her old barn cat friend look like a large rat by comparison. Louise couldn't believe she had been living in the same house as something so enormous without knowing about it. In hindsight, she was feeling awfully glad that her family avoided the house's larger patrons. After taking in the sights, Louise's thoughts turned back to the smell. The cat was rather unceremoniously lapping up a bowl of milk on the kitchen floor. It was a familiar sight for Louise. The barn cat did it all the time. But where was that smell coming from? The aroma certainly wasn't coming from mere milk, and there didn't seem to be anyone else in the kitchen. But Louise's nose didn't lie. This was definitely the room it was coming from. Just then, Louise heard a loud ding. She instinctively ducked down, thinking the cat had noticed her or Morgan had come to drag her home. In actuality, it averted the cat's attention even further away from Louise. Louise watched intently as the cat made its way over to one of the large kitchen boxes she had always found too risky to mess with during her scavenging. After responding to the ding, the cat returned to its milk bowl, and Louise became privy to the answers of two of her questions. Where was the smell coming from? And how was this cat so fat? It seemed a little strange to see a cat with a milk bowl without a food bowl to go with it. The cat returned not with one food bowl, but with 5. Each one contained a gloriously fattening dish beyond anything Louise's taste buds had encountered. If she couldn't smell it herself, she'd never believe it. Soft swirl ice cream sandwiched between 2 donuts, boiled shrimp coated in chocolate, a burrito stuffed with cheese fries and layered with honey, and one of the bowls looked to just contain a jar of mayonnaise with an ice cream cone stuck to its lid by way of caramel. The cat certainly had peculiar tastes. But Louise wasn't one to talk. Each bowl sent more and more saliva pouring out of her mouth until she finally caught herself and scooped her tongue off the floor. She knew she had to resist her burning desire to leap into the nearest bowl and join the cat in its feeding frenzy, but the food wasn't helping her sense of duty. The bright blue bowl closest to Louise had a ham, cheese, and marshmallow sandwich in it that was practically begging her to eat it. The raw fish in between the two bread slices was practically looking at her. She could hear it calling her name. Just one bite. Morgan and the cat will never know. Louise couldn't do it. She had to turn away. If the twin skulls on the cat's sides were good for anything, it was dissuading Louise from risking getting up close and personal with them. The last thing Louise wanted for was this creature to find out there were mice in the house. Wrestling herself free of the tantalizing odours and colours, Louise pulled her head back through the door and steeled herself to return home. The image of the cat eating was burned into her mind as she headed back, including one little detail that stood out to her. Louise had encountered those bowls before in an empty state. Each one was emblazoned with a single word must have identified its owner. Ambrosia. Louise's foray into the unknown had not gone unnoticed. While she had felt helpless to do anything as her mother brazenly wandered beyond any conceivable realm of safety, Morgan was all too eager to read her mother the riot act upon her return. Slamming the door to their home shut and locking it tightly, Morgan shoved her mother back into the dining room. Louise's feet dragged along the dirt floor in apprehension. Louise didn't make any excuses. She knew what she did was wrong. She knew Morgan's anger was justified. She had let her love of food take over and put an unnecessary risk on the family's head. This was not the Thrushwood way. What would her father think if he were here to see this? Louise didn't dare mention the sights she had seen, as she knew even hinting there was a cat in the house would send Morgan to the ceiling. She could still remember all the times Morgan would crawl into her bed at night, crying that she saw a cat tail outside her window. They had lived in a hollow log back then, and it took forever to convince Morgan that it was just a cat tail. But this time the cat tail was very real, and like the rest of the cat, it was bigger and fatter than even Louise had ever seen. Louise wasn't about to tell Morgan how close she had come to revealing herself to it, though it didn't seem like she could make things much worse for herself. Morgan insisted that if Louise was going to act like a child, then she would be treated like one. From that day forward, Louise was to follow all of the same rules as Morgan's children. No leaving the mouse hole or even looking outside of it under any circumstances. Naturally, this meant her scavenging days were officially over. Louise wanted to protest, but she had nothing to counter with. What she had done was reckless. What if she encountered such a delicious smell while scavenging? Would she be able to control herself then? It wasn't as though Morgan, Adam, and Abigail couldn't perform the job. It would probably be better in the long run for them to start getting that experience. Louise just wished her time didn't have to end so abruptly. Louise meekly accepted her daughter's punishment in silence. Though her sadness was overtaking her, it lessened as she handed Dirk his ball, watching the smile on his face as he scampered off to play with it. She wanted to keep feeling it, that feeling of providing for her family, that feeling of being useful. Whether she was a scavenger or not, she wanted to keep that feeling alive, even if she had to fight off 100 cats to make it happen. The following morning, Louise rose before the roosters crow to carry out her scavenger duties as normal, only realizing when she got to the front door that it was her first day of forced retirement. Morgan had modified the sign on the front door to say no children or old ladies beyond this point. Louise got the message, but she felt a bit slighted. She wasn't an old lady yet, so clearly this sign didn't apply to her. She looked back to confirm her kids were still snugly tucked in bed. Then she impishly pushed open the door and stuck one foot out, as if to stick a finger in the sign's eye. As she did, she suddenly felt glad that her kids had overslept. The gigantic cat that Louise had encountered the day before was suddenly before her, napping in the centre of the living room right next to the kitchen door. What was the beast doing here? Why now of all times? Louise had never encountered it before yesterday. Had it detected her? Had Louise given away that there were mice in the living room? Was it her drool? While all of these questions buzzed through her mind, they were all eclipsed by the second unusually large object in the room. A well-sized slice of cake, at least 3 times as big as Louise's whole body. It was resting on a plate, uneaten, right in front of the snoozing cat. Louise didn't know what to make of such a sight. Did the cat originally have the entire cake and fall asleep after eating all but one slice? Did someone set the cake down as a treat for the cat after it woke up? Was this cat perhaps so pampered that it coughed up cake slices instead of hairballs? In any case, it was clear that this cake was off limits. She knew her father's words all too well. Scavengers only took what was unwanted. Anything more was stealing. It didn't matter how much her tongue was screaming for satisfaction. It didn't matter how much it looked like that cat could sleep through construction work in a thunderstorm. It didn't matter how much untold joy her grandkids would experience receiving even a single lick of that frosting. There was simply no way she could run out and take a piece of that cake, even if it was within the safety zone. It was unthinkable. Yep, completely out of the question. Before Louise knew it, she was standing beside the cake, her heart pounding from her chest so loudly she was afraid it would wake the cat. She couldn't remember how she got there, or even when she put on her cape. Her nose had staged a mutiny and had taken control of her feet. Not that she realized such a thing at the time. It was too rational for her state of mind. Her mind was on the cake, the delicious, all-important cake. Her eyes were practically turning pink to match its glossy glow as she shambled towards it like a zombie. How much could she take? Was it better to go for the front or the back? Could she dare make 2 trips? Should she use her cheeks like a squirrel to carry as much as possible? Would it still be edible if she did? All of these fleeting thoughts eventually gave way to one word. Strawberry. Without skipping a beat, she thoughtlessly clambered onto the cake slice and seized the crown jewel resting on top of it, twirled around and sprinted back to safety, out of the snoozing behemoth's long reach. At least that's how it went in her head. In reality, her legs had become nothing more than wheels spinning in the mud. They were moving quickly, but her body wasn't going, and there was a suspiciously heavy weight now resting on her tail that even her cake-addled brain couldn't ignore. Louise suddenly understood the feeling her daughter had felt when fearfully climbing into her parents' covers all those years ago. With thoughts of frosting and happiness forcefully ejected from her mind, all now she could dream about was the thought of her dad petting her head and comforting her with the revelation that it was only a cattail. By the time the cat released its vice grip on Louise's tail, the mouse was too paralyzed by fear to even consider running. With much of her mental facilities restricted, Louise could only stare up at the controller of her fate. The massive beast glared down at her with those watchful green eyes, shining bright enough to illuminate a dark room. As the two stared motionlessly at one another, a desperate thought of hope managed to escape the tangled maze of Louise's mind. It was true this cat was beyond intimidating in appearance, but Louise wasn't entirely sure what kind of personality it had. She knew it had an appetite that could rival even her own, but beyond that she had no clue what category this creature fell under. Perhaps at heart it was no different than the timid barn cat she and her dad had befriended all those years ago. Finding the strength to speak, Louise called out the name she had seen written on those food bowls. Ambrosia. Based on the way the cat's ears pricked up, Louise was convinced that she had guessed its name correctly. It gave her the courage to continue. She began by apologizing to the cat for disturbing its sleep and taking its strawberry. She set the strawberry down as a peace offering, insisting that the cat would never see hide nor hair of her again if it let her go. She attempted to butter the cat up, insisting that a cat so big surely had a big heart to match. She was reasonably certain it was a lady cat, so she added that a lovely lady like herself surely didn't have the stomach for violence. She gauged the cat's face for a reaction. Louise wasn't certain, but she thought it was smiling, so she smiled back as best she could, putting all of the manners her dad had taught her to use. Was she getting through to it? Had she said something wrong? Could the cat understand her words? She wasn't ashamed to become a total kiss-up, but she wasn't certain what traits the cat would even want to be praised for. Was it proud of its fluffiness? Its appetite? Its fur markings? Louise didn't know what to praise, but she knew she had to pick something. In the end, she blurted out that she'd never seen such a fat cat before, and she instantly felt the colour seep out of her pores. Why had she said that? It had sounded much better in her head. But who would ever take that as a compliment? Accepting that she had possibly sealed her fate, Louise put on her cutest, most innocent face, and then she waited to see how the cat would respond. Back when Louise lived in the barn with her dad, she would often play fetch with the barn cat. She'd tie up some hay into a ball and toss it out the window, watching with joy and amusement as the cat would clumsily fumble over itself to clamber out the window and retrieve it, only to bring it back with an ignorant grin on its face, hungry for more. Louise never understood what made that cat so eager to chase around a simple ball of hay, so she was surprised to see Ambrosia present her with a similar toy, a ball made entirely of yarn instead of hay. Louise got closer to inspect the yarn, checking to see if there was anything special about it. After finding nothing spectacular, Louise offered to play fetch, feeling a little nostalgic at the prospect. Ambrosia simply nudged the yarn closer, as if suggesting Louise to take a closer look. Curious, Louise peered into the tangled maze of yarn. As she stared, she felt her mind slipping away into the crisscrossing red lines. She started appreciating it like a work of art, the lines flowing in random yet orderly methods and converged into one collective sphere. Was this what Ambrosia wanted to show her? Was this cat a lover of the arts? Louise was beginning to see the appeal. Before Louise could get too impressed, she suddenly realized that it wasn't just her mind that was lost in the bright red yarn. It was her body, too. As she was admiring the look of the yarn ball, something had shoved her inside from behind. She scrambled to free herself, but she only ended up hopelessly entangled, loosely enough that she could squirm, but firmly enough that she couldn't squirm free. She cried out Ambrosia's name for assistance, but by that point the ride had already started. Up and down Louise was thrown, carelessly and playfully. The yarn ball would fall onto the cat's paws, getting kicked around before being launched high into the air once more. Were Louise 20 years younger, the experience may have been exhilarating. But right there, in that moment, it was all she could do to keep her heart from leaping out her mouth and screaming. Was this her punishment? Was she getting her just desserts for stealing the strawberry? She wasn't used to such a thing. Her dad had been one to spare the rod when Louise acted up. She wondered if her gluttonous mannerisms would be as much of an issue if she had someone like Ambrosia as a mum. Perhaps this would be good for her in the long run. While she couldn't stop herself from squeaking in terror, Louise decided to suck it up and accept the cat's punishment. After all, if she could earn the cat's forgiveness, it was worth a little mortal terror. Despite Louise's best efforts, it seemed her mortal terror was slated to last a little longer. After Ambrosia finally tired of the yarn ball, the cat suddenly dropped it and walked off, as if its mind was suddenly wiped of Louise's existence. Louise thought it was a good sign, as if the prison guard had just thoughtlessly dropped the keys to her cell in front of her. However, she still couldn't quite squirm free of the yarn. She spent a few minutes struggling, using her teeth to gnaw through the tasteless licorice. But just as she was about to find an opening, a loud and mysterious wind from above suddenly ripped her from her bonds and took gravity as payment. Louise was sucked into a dark plastic tube. There was hardly an inch of room to move around. She had slept in sewer pipes that were more spacious. But before she could make heads or tails of her predicament, the mysterious gust of wind roared again, this time spitting her out of the tube and into the open air once again. The air just kept blasting out at her, and Louise was left dangling in place, too small to fall and too heavy to float. It was then that Louise realized she was being assaulted by some kind of air-controlling device. And at her backside was Ambrosia, manning the switch to the machine. Louise understood clearly. This was the second phase of her punishment. Every few seconds, Ambrosia would flick the switch back and forth, changing the direction of the wind to pull Louise in and out of the tube. Looking at Ambrosia's face, Louise could see a sinister grin that only seemed to grow the more Louise squeaked. Was this more than just an act of justice? Was this payback for the fat cat comment? Thinking about it, Louise herself had once set a pitfall trap for an ex-lover that called her a fat rat, and her expression at the time wasn't too different than Ambrosia's was now. Perhaps it would be hypercritical to hold this cat in contempt for getting enjoyment out of this. With that in mind, Louise decided to let the cat have her catharsis. Though her sides started to chafe from sliding in and out of the tube so much, at least she could feel good that she wasn't yet too fat to fit inside. Louise couldn't fathom how much longer this punishment would go on. After Ambrosia tired of the wind machine, Louise was taken into the next room over. It wasn't the kitchen, so Louise had never encountered it before. Much of it was too dark to see, but Louise could make out the desk that hosted a series of black boxes on it, with one of the black boxes off to the side on the floor. Ambrosia grabbed a small round device that was resting on a thin rectangular cushion and tossed it aside, placing Louise on the cushion in its place. Then the cat pressed a button on the lower box, and a blinding light shone from the upper one, accompanied by a fanfare of electronic instruments. Ambrosia sat down in the chair in front of the desk and put on a set of fancy-looking earmuffs with an attached stick that extended to Ambrosia's mouth. Louise wasn't sure what purpose the earmuffs served, as Ambrosia wasn't even wearing them on her ears. Nevertheless, the cat was fixated on the glowing box, while at the same time refusing to release her grip on Louise. In terms of punishment, it was far tamer than the yarn ball or the air machine. Ambrosia would slide Louise around the mat with erratic movements, occasionally pressing down on Louise's backside every few seconds. Louise couldn't understand how this movement translated to the shiny box, as Ambrosia seemed to be really happy with what was going on, hardly paying any mind to the mouse at all. Perhaps Louise was being used as a stress ball, while Ambrosia consulted the shiny box. Reaching into the desk, Ambrosia pulled out some junk food to snack on during her box game. The smell surprised Louise, as she had never imagined that food could be found in the house outside of the kitchen. She was especially surprised to see Ambrosia pull out a homemade ice cream float that was still projecting its coldness. Fridges go in kitchens, not dark mystery rooms. Did this cat have a second fridge just for playing box games? More importantly, Louise was desperately trying to figure out if she had managed to win the cat's favour yet. She was content to act as the stress ball or whatever if the cat would just sign a release on her detainment. Once she got used to it, the pressure from Ambrosia's paw was even a bit relaxing, like a deep tissue massage. She wanted to ask Ambrosia if they were square, but it didn't seem like quite the right time to ask. Whatever game Ambrosia was playing, she appeared to be winning. Louise's eyes still hadn't adjusted to the light after being removed from the box room, but she could tell from the colour of the wallpaper that she was in another new room. She wondered if she would ever see the living room or her beloved family again. Short of earning Ambrosia's forgiveness, Louise had been counting on the cat getting bored or running out of things for her to do, but each of the cat's cages just seemed to give way to another. After having her fill of snacks and box games, Ambrosia seemed to be in the mood for a nap. It made sense. Most of Louise's memories of cats involved them sleeping, or being drowsy enough to lull to sleep, a fact to which she attributed most of her family's survival. Even so, it seemed she wouldn't be getting out of this one quite so easily, as Ambrosia sat a hairbrush in front of Louise before assuming the curled position of a sleepy kitty. She also refused to close her eyes until Louise began brushing her fur, reopening them each time Louise took a break. Louise calculated her options. Even if Ambrosia did nod off, Louise felt as though all of her goodwill would fly out the window if she was suddenly gone when Ambrosia woke up. And that was assuming she could even get away. What if she made a run for it before Ambrosia was fully asleep? There was no way she could outrun a cat at her age. Beyond that, where would she even go? She didn't even know what room she was in, which might have even been the reason the cat chose this room for nap time. Who knew what kind of crazy rooms this house was hiding? One wrong turn could take her right into the hall of mousetraps. She may as well have been trapped in a maze. Without some pungent cheese to guide her to the exit, her feet were glued in place. While her condition was disconcerting, there was something else eating away at her. Before settling down, Ambrosia had brought with her a bowl of buttered brownie bites from the box room to serve as one final snack before bed. Though the promise of escape was tempting, Louise could hardly focus with those puppies licking her nose. Like the strawberry cake that came before, the smell was heavenly, and this time they were tantalizingly close. One of them was even hanging out of its porcelain lodging, extending its reach towards Louise like a forbidden lover. Louise wanted to accept its embrace, to grant it a simple peck on the cheek. She might have gotten away with it had she been pampering one of the lazy cats from her childhood. Because of that fact, she underestimated Ambrosia's energy and greed. Louise never could have imagined just how watchful the cat's eyes were when it came to her food. Louise was practically humming her funeral march as Ambrosia carried her into the kitchen. She felt no different than when Morgan had caught her the previous morning before. Once again, she felt unable to make an excuse. She had fallen victim to her tongue twice in 2 days. The best she could hope for at this stage was a well-seasoned casket. After wedging Louise inside a salt shaker to keep her in place, Ambrosia grabbed a large loaf of bread from the pantry. The size of the bread astounded Louise, but it was quickly wiped from her mind as Ambrosia pulled open the fridge. As the faintest chill from the big icy box blew across her face, Louise's jaw fell open. She was starstruck. Her vision rapidly switched from blurry to picture perfect as she ogled over every sacred treasure she could spot. All the meals she and Morgan could prepare if she got her paws on just one of them. Louise's mind buzzed with images of her family dipping all of their potato crumbs in ketchup or sampling something as exotic as zucchini. Never mind all the meat that was in that fridge. Louise could recall the time her dad had managed to snag the two of them a leg of wild bird. The bird was awfully huffy about it, but even getting an earful of bird poop couldn't have ruined the magic of that experience. What a marvel it would be to share it with her grandkids. Louise couldn't even take notice of why Ambrosia opened the fridge or what she was rummaging around for. She was captivated by the sights and smells that were courting her eyes, nose, and tongue. All this time, this was the paradise she had blinded herself to by adhering to her father's no-risk principles. She felt as if a blindfold had been pulled from her eyes. To experience something such as this, how could she not take the risk? If only she had realized sooner, she and her family would have known full bellies, if only for a little while. Instead, she was filled with regret and shame. Regret that none of this food would ever reach her own lips or the lips of her family. And shame that her final moments would involve her spitting on her father's legacy by abandoning his principles in both body and spirit. All she could hope for was that his eyes still weren't good enough to see her as he watched from on high. Was this refrigerator the science lab where Ambrosia concocted her ridiculous food combinations? The cauldron that summoned her magical artifacts? It had to be. There was no mistaking it. Louise vowed that if she somehow survived Ambrosia's punishment, she would bring at least a crumb from that fridge back home, even if she were reduced to her head and had to store it in her cheeks. No matter how long the moment seemed to last, it was still just a moment. Eventually the fridge shut, and Ambrosia returned with the tools of her trade. Louise recognized the items she was holding immediately. Sandwich fixings. She gulped, for what she figured would be the last time, as Ambrosia put on her chef's hat and began slicing the bread in two. Ambrosia pulled Louise from her salt shaker prison and removed her cape and glasses, presumably to increase her flavor profile. Then Louise was placed between two fluffy buns of the bread variety. Once the mouse was in place, there were no rules for what else was placed to act as her neighbours. Lettuce, tomato, mayonnaise, peanut butter, raw fish, whipped cream, and a slice of pizza for texture. It was a signature Ambrosia creation. Though Louise had been willing to accept her punishment, once she was inside the sandwich, her survival instincts took hold. She didn't want things to end like this. She wanted to see her family again. She wanted to eat tasty food. But now wasn't the time to think about snacking. Ignoring all of the delicious toppings that surrounded her, Louise scampered towards the end of the sandwich furthest from Ambrosia, hoping the cat's chomping was slowed by all the snacks she ate earlier. Ideally, with all the toppings the sandwich had, the cat wouldn't even notice she was missing. She poked her head out of the sandwich, squeaking in terror as she strained to pull her back half free as well. After finally freeing herself, she started to make a run for it, but paused when she didn't hear Ambrosia's massive footsteps chasing after her. As she looked back, she was further surprised by the fact that Ambrosia hadn't even taken a bite of her sandwich. She was instead holding her belly, her tongue flailing out of her mouth as she trilled in amusement at Louise's performance. Louise's face turned bright red. First in embarrassment, then in anger. She was beginning to suspect this cat was messing with her. With a pickle on her head and a chip on her shoulder, Louise was positively beside herself. Putting her in a sandwich and eating her was one thing, but being a big bully was inexcusable. Neither Louise nor her father would ever tolerate such behaviour. It riled Louise up more than anything. She could recall a time when Davy was something of a bully to his brothers, and she had felt compelled to set him straight even more than Morgan did. When it came to such things, she didn't care how big or intimidating Ambrosia looked. This cat needed to be taught some manners. After being taken back to the living room for Ambrosia's next game, Louise insisted on digging in her heels and calling Ambrosia out. Like a stern mother, Louise lectured Ambrosia about treating others with respect, as well as being grateful for the food she had. And like a rebellious teenage daughter, Ambrosia only stared back with a smirk, playfully chomping at a leftover cucumber from her sandwich, while she looked down on Louise as if onlooking a circus performance. It was clear that Louise's words weren't getting through Ambrosia's thick skull. Such a feat would take action, and Louise knew just the action to take. She would need to employ the strategy she had once used to get Davy on the straight and narrow. Standing tall despite her head pickle, Louise challenged Ambrosia to 3 events of her choosing. If Louise lost even one, Ambrosia could do as she wished with her. But if Louise won all 3, then Ambrosia would have to share some of the food from her fridge with Louise and her family. What a time for Morgan to finally wake up for scavenging duty. Morgan had no idea what her mother was thinking. She didn't even know where to begin. What was her mother doing outside the mouse hole? Why did she blatantly ignore her note on the door? Why didn't she have her sword? Why was she helping a 4-legged killing machine set up an obstacle course? More importantly, why was the 4-legged killing machine helping her do the same? Morgan had only met one cat before in her life, and she could still remember the hungry look in its eyes as it picked her up with its tail and licked her across the face for a taste. Lucky for her, that cat wasn't fond of the flavour, but this walking she-demon looked fit to scarf down the entire family as a morning snack. Had they really been living alongside such a monster? Morgan didn't understand why or how her mother had lost her mind, but she certainly wasn't about to step in and doom them both. Her mother was on her own. Even so, Morgan's curiosity compelled her to watch. Why had her mother challenged a cat to an obstacle course? And why had the cat agreed? After setting up the chalkboard to act as a scorekeeper, the first event was on. Though the stakes were high, Ambrosia was still only playing around, high-stepping beside Louise at a brisk pace while the mouse ran as fast as she could. Ambrosia intentionally knocked over every obstacle she came across. Whether it was intentional or sheer clumsiness, it didn't matter. The obstacles only served as the path to the finish line, and none of them incurred any penalties as long as they were passed. Louise didn't complain either. Her plan didn't come into play until the final obstacle. With the last set of obstacles before them, Morgan could barely watch. That cat had her mother dancing in its paw the entire race, and Louise could barely keep up. After Ambrosia cleared the last hurdle, all that remained was a pair of crawl tubes, one for each competitor. Louise was still nearing the top of her ladder, trying to climb her own final hurdle as Ambrosia slid into her crawl tube. Then, just as Ambrosia pulled her head out to squeeze through the tube and deliver the final blow, she suddenly stopped. Her backside wasn't following her. Cats were known for their ability to squeeze through narrow spaces, but such an ability had its limits. Louise knew this, and she knew in Ambrosia's case that limit was the size of her massive derriere. Though the cat had no problem squeezing herself into the tube, no amount of squirming was going to get her back out. Like a piping bag clogged with too much cookie dough, that cat wasn't going anywhere, much less crossing the finish line. The best she could do was helplessly roll from side to side, unable to move an inch forward. She had become one with the tube, and that meant Louise was free to clear her own tube and take first place in the first event. As a mouse, she fit through hers with ease. Were Louise a certain kind of mouse, she would have been tempted to let Ambrosia get used to her new way of life. But Louise always kept her promises, and she was insistent on completing the 3 challenges. She left right away to get the butter, instead of accepting vindication for calling Ambrosia a fat cat as her prize. Morgan wasn't too keen on the idea of releasing the cat from its big blue shackle, but she had to admit she was impressed her mother could show the creature up. With a face full of shame and a belly full of butter, Ambrosia's tail waggled in anticipation of the second event. Louise could tell she was no longer playing around, and given her performance in the obstacle course, Louise didn't blame her. Louise had planned for this, though, and was ready to announce the second event. Of the few cat toys Louise could name, there was one she could call her favourite. One that her father had once used to save her from a whole basket of kittens. The dot maker. Louise knew cats loved chasing around the red dot made by the dot maker, even cats that didn't like to run. That was why she knew Ambrosia had to have one, and it didn't take much probing for Ambrosia to draw it out of her toy box, which meant Louise had everything she needed for the event. Using the dot maker, Louise would try to keep the dot away from Ambrosia for 10 minutes. If Ambrosia caught it before time ran out, she would win. If Louise's dot could evade her for all that time, she would win. In order for the light to be caught, Ambrosia would need to hold it in her paws for at least 5 seconds. And to make sure Ambrosia was content with these conditions, Louise made sure to offer Ambrosia the option to refuse the challenge. That is, if it was too difficult for her. Naturally, Ambrosia would never refuse after such a statement. She indicated her acceptance by lowering into a pouncing position. Louise nodded and started the timer. Morgan was given a front row seat as a cat transformed into a frog before her very eyes. Having been drawn out of her mouse hole to watch more closely, it was all she could do to hold in her laughter. The cat was clumsily and determinedly leaping and flopping its way around the living room, desperately trying to catch a collection of light. As the cat's frustration increased, it began diving into the light head first, trying to catch it in its mouth. It paid little mind to what its face slammed into, whether it be floor, wall, or lamp. Morgan could commend the cat's resilience, though she started to wonder if it was actually just an oversized kitten. Even Sophia wouldn't fall for such a simple trick. Louise felt a little bad for deceiving Ambrosia. In truth, the real challenge was for Ambrosia to reject the challenge. Once Ambrosia failed that, it was already over for her. On the one hand, Louise hoped she could show Ambrosia how it felt to be deceived, but she also didn't want to deceive herself. She knew that a part of this was payback for Ambrosia's contemptible treatment of her earlier, as she couldn't stop smiling as Ambrosia got more and more flustered trying to catch the laser. After the timer went off, Ambrosia was left with empty paws and egg on her face. It would all be settled in the final challenge.